So I just want to slash any potential myth that I know everything there is about mindfulness, because that's certainly not the case. It's a wonderful topic to explore in terms of the science of it, but as a practice, it's far deeper. And I came to it originally because while I had tried meditation in the past, it was never a practice that had stuck with me. And during one of my more difficult times in life, I finally started committing to a daily practice. And what I noticed were a set of benefits that not only helped my well-being, but my actual performance in sort of cognitive areas. And from there, that's what led me to begin my PhD. So it began as a personal journey, and as I've continued the research, I can really see the empirical case first from my own experience and then from what other scholars are producing. This presentation is designed to be an overview of what mindfulness is conceptually, and also some experiential components where together we will actually practice some traditional foundational mindfulness practices like a body scan and a breathing exercise. It's also going to cover some of the research broadly of what we know and how mindfulness is being studied in the workplace and what the outcomes that are relevant to work are. And I'll also share with you a little bit about some of my own research along the way. So just to give a sense of who is dialed in, from my understanding, we have a number of stakeholders, so people that are perhaps going to be bringing mindfulness into their own organization or are seeking mindfulness as a means to help themselves in some way. And there may also be some researchers. So I'm going to continue on the basis that you know perhaps very little about mindfulness, and so here comes the background. When I look at today's current work environment, there is a trend that we are overworked, that this tension between work-life balance is difficult to manage, that we're always on, and whether it's technology that's helping us manage work or perhaps hindering our ability to separate work and life, that there are costs to this high-stress, high-performance culture that we are all working within. I think the result of this is that we are stressed out. The general pattern is that I hear often is, I can't stop thinking. Burnout and emotional exhaustion are concepts that are being studied more often and are more recurrent because we're working so hard, and whether it's work itself that makes us feel like we have to keep going, or whether it's other societal pressures that make you feel as if you have to do more, produce more, look a certain way, etc. There's constant pressure on us to do and be and perform. What this ends up creating is this sense that our minds are they've run away from us. And I love this cartoon because, well, one, it's funny, but also when you think about how often we use our mind, and work is often referred to as the knowledge economy, so we're highly cognitive beings operating in the workplace and in life in general. There's very little that we do to actually start training the muscles of our mind. And so for most of us, our thoughts are just doing their own thing. And today we know that eating well and exercise is good for our physiology. This is common knowledge. So even if you don't exercise, you think, yes, I should probably exercise. I should probably eat an apple instead of a cookie. And I think with mindfulness, we're moving towards a direction where we're starting to understand there is an inherent benefit in engaging in practices that actually start training how our mind works. And what I mean by that is what you pay attention to, our ability to control that, and then hold our attention for a sustained period of time on an object of our choosing. So some of these mindfulness practices do just that, and I will explain how in a little bit. So here is some general background on mindfulness. The first I'd like to start with is the sort of going academic definition that gets referenced. So Jon Kabat-Zinn, for those if you haven't heard his name, is often credited as being the sort of father of mindfulness in the West. This is a man that, obtained a PhD from MIT, has a long mindfulness practice of his own, went out to the East, studied with several Zen masters, and then comes back to the West, creating this mindfulness-based stress reduction program in sort of the 70s, 80s. And brings mindfulness to the West in a way that it's secular. So there's no real mention of Buddhist traditions or any of the contemplative traditions that mindfulness as a concept arose from. Instead, he simply calls it the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and without judgment. So the first thing I want to address in this definition is that it's not just paying attention in the present moment, but it's something that is emerging from that kind of practice. And in a sense, I like to refer to this as meta-awareness, or awareness of awareness. So whatever you're paying attention to, there's something broader, almost as if seeing it from a bird's eye view, that is what the awareness or attention is focused on. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is this image in the corner of the screen. So I've got a picture of sort of 5 or 6 rocks stacked on top of each other over this beautiful ripple of water. And actually, if you were to Google image mindfulness, you would see many, many pictures of this kind of stacked rock. And I think it gives a sense that mindfulness is this absolute Zen state where your mind is clear and you're completely at peace. And I think that is just an illusion that let's try to dispel very early, because it's not that. And for many people, mindfulness feels inaccessible because they think, gosh, I can't sit still for that long, or I can't stop thinking. There's no way I can empty my mind. This isn't what mindfulness is, despite how it's being portrayed. It's simply an awareness of whatever's happening in the present moment without judgment. Perhaps another way to think about mindfulness is by contrasting it to sort of an antithesis, which I'll call mindlessness. And another way to think of mindlessness is automatic, habitual reactions. So I've got a picture of the brain on my screen here, because what we know is that we are highly automatic beings because this is incredibly efficient in terms of our cognitive capacity. If you had to think about every action or movement that you needed to take to execute a certain task, it would be literally exhausting. So if you think about how you began when you first learned to drive, and you're concerned about where your hands are on the steering wheel and the mirror, and you're looking over your shoulder, and every step you take is calculated. And then after a few years of driving, we're far more cavalier because these processes have become completely automatized. And while it's incredibly efficient, to some extent, it doesn't always serve us. So if you have the same automatic reaction to whatever's emerging in your present moment, at some point, we've stopped thinking. And whether or not you benefit from that automatic reaction is something we're not even evaluating anymore. Another concept I want to take a moment just to parse through is the difference between mindfulness and meditation. And this is a question that comes up all the time because these words are often conflated or used interchangeably. So John Kabat-Zinn will say that mindfulness is a term that you can think of as one large umbrella encompassing many other types that fall underneath, one of which is meditation. So meditation would be the actual technique or practice that might cultivate a state of mindfulness overall as this umbrella term. And it allows us to refine our mental process so that we can experience this state of mindfulness. So I hope that's clear. I like this image because I think it's the simplest way to actually grasp what mindfulness is. So there's a kitten looking into a mirror, seeing the reflection of a lion. And for some of us, you know, we may be a lion and yet we see a kitten. Or you could be a kitten that sees a lion. In any case, mindfulness is just seeing things clearly as they are, without any greater elaboration or excessive narrative that we have to create. It's just accepting and seeing things as they really are, which for most of us is actually quite difficult. When it comes to sort of the inner workings of mindfulness, the mechanisms, the how behind mindfulness, are often referred to by Shapiro, this paper that came out 10 years ago now, as some combination of intention, attention, and attitude. So your intention is, why am I engaging in X at this particular time? And once you set your intention, that may guide your attention. And based on that, that's what we focus on. Then the attitude is sort of a larger encompassing blanket that we imbue through our experience. And when we come across words like open, accepting, trust, intuition, letting go, these sort of attitudinal components of mindfulness and the general non-evaluative state of it, this is what we mean by attitude. So in any moment, do I know what my intention is? And based on that intention, how does that direct where I place my attention? And what attitudes can I bring to this moment, to this interaction, to be a little bit more mindful? This brings us to our first practice. So I think it's very critical to distinguish this conceptual understanding of what mindfulness is compared to actually experiencing it. And this shows up actually in my research, which I will talk about in a moment. However, it's easy to think about mindfulness and say, this sounds lovely. Present moment awareness. I'm going to be more engaged with whoever's before me. I'm going to be non-judgmental. These things all sound great. However, conceptually understanding it and then feeling that sense of awareness itself is really quite different. So at this point, I would love to invite you to actually try a little bit of mindfulness. So wherever you are, and hopefully you can find somewhat of a quiet space just to limit some of that distraction. I'm going to invite you to sit a little bit further back in your chair, taking an upright and tall, dignified position with the spine, allowing the hands to fall and sit wherever feels comfortable. And then if it's available to you, if you feel comfortable, closing the eyes or maybe just hooding the eyes and looking downward at one point. So as you sit here, just give yourself a moment to allow your physiology to settle. Perhaps just taking stock of how you feel, maybe drowsy or warm, uncomfortable, hungry. Just checking in very briefly. And now bringing your attention to your breath. Simply knowing that you're inhaling and knowing that you're exhaling. No need to change the breath, just observing how the body breathes itself. Following the inhale as it enters the body, and following the exhale as it leaves the body. Should your mind wander, that's okay. Simply guide it back once you've noticed, following the next breath in and the next breath out. Body breathes in and body breathes out. Place your attention on a region of the body where you can feel the breath, perhaps in the belly, as the belly expands and contracts with your inhale and exhale. It may be in the chest where you feel the chest rise and fall with the in-breath and the out-breath. Perhaps you feel your breath in the nostrils, feeling the breath come in and the breath come out, perhaps a gentle tickle of air on the upper lip as you exhale. Over and over, the mind will wander. So over and over, just gently guide your attention back to the next breath in and the next breath out. Wherever you are, bring all of your awareness to a final breath in and a final breath out. And then when you feel ready, coming back to your surroundings. So as this is a webinar, I really can't see you. But I hope that was okay for you wherever you are, and welcome back. I'd like to take you through the neural mechanisms of what we just did there. Because as I said earlier, this type of practice is literally training the muscles of our mind to focus and hold focus for some sustained period of time. So this comes from a 2013 paper where he's looking at the actual networks in the brain that are lighting up as someone moves through this process. So on the left side of the screen, we see alerting. So we focus on an object. And in this case, it was our breath. So your breath is your anchor, your point of focus. And then, because, you know, it's impossible for our minds not to wander, the mind wanders. We get distracted. We fall into what's known as the default mode that's either in the future or in the past. It's thinking, 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 and off it goes. The third step is that we need to recognize that the mind has wandered, because usually it goes off and we're deep down this rabbit hole before we have to say, oh, okay, I'm off my breath. That's the wandering stage, after which we actually need to let go of whatever it was that we were thinking of. So sometimes when we're maybe you've gotten in an argument with your partner, or something upsetting has happened at work, or it's the night before Christmas and you're really excited and you can't stop thinking about Christmas. Sometimes it's difficult for us to stop thinking or ruminating over some particular topic. So this is, in fact, a very important muscle that we need to practice letting go of whatever our thought pattern is. And then we shift. So this is the final stage. We shift back. You make a conscious decision to come back to the anchor. And in this practice, it was our breath. And then the cycle continues. So focus, distraction, recognize that you've been mind wandering, let it go, and then come back. This is, in fact, you know, you can think of this as a workout. So this is one rep. And your mind has to wander for this rep to be effective. This brings us to some of the research. So let's jump right in. 2:25. So I'm going to share with you a video by Dan Harris. Dan Harris is a news anchor that's written 10% Happier, which is a book he wrote after he burnt out on air. So he was presenting, he's live on camera, and he just completely burns out. And this type of experience, if you spend some time with the news, is not infrequent. You have high-profile leaders that are just collapsing literally on stage from stress or other components that they're just not aware of that are showing up in their life. So he will introduce.
There's no way a fidgety and skeptical news anchor would ever have started meditating were it not for the science. The science is really compelling. It shows that meditation can boost your immune system, lower your blood pressure, help you deal with problems ranging from irritable bowel syndrome to psoriasis. And the neuroscience is where it really gets sci-fi. There was a study out of Harvard that shows that short daily doses of meditation can literally grow the gray matter in key areas of your brain having to do with self-awareness and compassion, and shrink the gray matter in the area associated with stress. There's also a study out of Yale that looked at what's called the default mode network of the brain. It's a connected series of brain regions that are active during most of our waking hours when we're doing that thing that human beings do all the time, which is obsessing about ourselves, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, doing anything but being focused on what's happening right now. Meditators not only turn off the default mode network of their brain while they're meditating, but even when they're not meditating. In other words, meditators are setting a new default mode. And what's that default mode? They're focused on what's happening right now. In sports, this is called being in the zone. It's nothing mystical. It's not magical. You're not floating off into cosmic ooze. You are just being where you are. The cliche in self-help circles is being in the now. You can use that term if you want, but because it's accurate. It's slightly annoying, but it's accurate. It's more just being focused on what you're doing. And the benefits of that are enormous. And this is why you're seeing these unlikely meditators now, why you're seeing the U.S. Marines adopting it, the U.S. Army, corporate executives from the head of Ford to the founders of Twitter, athletes from Phil Jackson to many, many Olympians, scientists, doctors, lawyers, school children. There's this sort of elite subculture of high achievers who are adopting this because they know it can help you be more focused on what you're doing and it can stop you from being yanked around by the voice in your head. My powers of prognostication are not great. I bought a lot.
I'm going to stop that there because that's, I think, a very fine introduction to what he mentions as the default mode. So in the brain, when we experience ourselves, we're either in this narrative mode or an experiential mode of self-reference. And this shows up as distinct networks lighting up in the brain if I were to place you in an fMRI machine. To get a sense of the narrative mode, which is in fact our default mode, I have a picture on the left. So just imagine yourself walking down the street. Are you thinking about where you're going? Maybe you're reliving the meeting you just came from. Maybe you're talking to yourself about a list of things that you need to bring back home with you before at the end of the workday. You know, we're often just in our heads. The experiential mode, on the other hand, I've got this picture of sort of a hockey game. So we've got Crosby shooting the winning goal of the World Juniors game, and afterwards a reporter asks him, what was going through your mind when you shot that goal? And Crosby says, well, I saw the puck, I lifted my stick, and I shot it into the net. And this is the difference, because he is completely engaged in his sensory moment-by-moment experience, which is quite different than how we might normally walk around. When we're walking around, we're often not thinking about the sensation of our weight as it shifts from left foot to right foot, or the position of our arms as we swing, as we move. In essence, the more that we can engage the experiential mode of reference, this is where the mindfulness practice begins. Dan Harris also said that part of the default mode is that we're anywhere but here. And indeed, a study found that about 47% of the time, our minds are off task. So this was a experience sampling study done, and what that means is that at multiple points during the day, you're receiving a ping on your smartphone that asks you a set of questions. In this case, they were asking you, what are you doing? Are you on task or off task? And how happy are you? And what was interesting is that whether or not you were on task or off task was a better predictor of how happy you were than the actual activity you were engaged in. So if you were doing the dishes, but actively doing the dishes and being present to the actual task, that might be more predictive of your happiness level than whether you were on a roller coaster at the fair. These examples are amusing for myself. Bear with me. In any case, for the lot of you that have dialed in, what we can presume is that half of what I'm saying you're not listening to because you're thinking about something else, and that is incredibly inefficient. And the question we have to ask is, what are we missing when we're not here in the present? Dan Harris also said, you know, it's the neuroscience where it starts to get sci-fi. And indeed, this is largely a part of why mindfulness has gained so much momentum in these sort of present days, because we have very compelling research that supports its case. So one of the things he mentioned was that we're actually growing gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. And this is sort of the front area of the brain. And all of our executive functions take place here. So strategizing, analysis, decision-making, as well as perspective taking or you know, other orientations, so empathy, compassion, etc., are taking place up here. This is the area where when we say we can't stop thinking is being highly activated. And he also mentioned that our stress zones are being decreased, and one example of this is the amygdala. So the amygdala are two lobes that hang on the side of your head, so just sort of above your ears. And this is largely responsible for our flight, fight, or freeze response, and it's highly reactive to emotion. However, often the things that we're reacting to in such emotional or stress-related ways may or may not actually be that stressful. However, in the brain, it's difficult to distinguish whether it's a, you know, saber-toothed tiger, which is the classic caveman example, or just a really terrifying email from your boss. Our brain is having the same stress response. What we see with sort of long-term meditation training, so that might be an 8-week MBSR course, or there are also a series of studies where they're taking long-term meditators and comparing them against novice meditators to see the differences in their brain. What we see is that how your amygdala is responding to stress and how it interacts with the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the wiser system that starts to talk down the stress levels so that you can better manage your response, interact differently, so that it's much quicker that your prefrontal cortex can intervene and create or evaluate the situation so that you are less likely to have a more amplified stress response. There's so much science in this area in particular that's interesting, and we just don't have heaps of time here, but if people have questions, there's so many really exciting advancements in this area. In the workplace in particular, I think you can group the benefits of what we're seeing into these 3 broad categories. And in a very recent sort of literature review, this set of researchers put them in 3 buckets. The first is well-being. So stress reduction, greater immune function, less absenteeism, etc. Then you have another bucket, which is attention and focus. So a lot of performance benefits come from here. Fewer errors, for example, just in terms of your cognitive capacity, we see working memory expand, as well as sort of sustained attention. So if a goldfish has a 12-second attention span, as a recent study from Microsoft just came out with, humans these days were somewhere around 9 seconds of attention. So instead of a decreasing trend, people that meditate are increasing their attention span, their sustained ability to focus. And then the third bucket is relationships. So we do see a set of interpersonal benefits, whether it's leader-member exchange or some deeper connection in the relationship between leaders and their followers or the people they're managing. This may happen through improved communication. We see listening, empathy, skills like this begin to develop. And some of the research actually came out of marital counseling, where they're looking at the ability of a couple to apply some of that meta-awareness that I was speaking about earlier, the bird's eye view of experience, so that when you're fighting about trivial issues that don't matter, who did the dishes last, then you can actually step back and look at that and say, hey, you know what, this isn't a big deal, let's move on. On the right, I have a series of more specific examples of what's come out of the literature, and there's just a growing body of studies that are finding some benefit to mindfulness at work. I just wanted to give a quick nod to a research study that I've just finished. So we were looking at the relationship of mindfulness to error attitudes. And what I mean by error attitudes is when you realize you've made a mistake, what is the immediate cognitive and emotional reaction you're having to recognizing that you've made a mistake? So do you feel afraid? Do you feel shame or fear, or do you not worry about it at all? And how might this impact whether you report the error or learn from the error or worry about the error that you've just made? What we did was take all of the participants and split them up into a mindfulness training, a Pilates group, and just a no treatment control. And they engaged in this training for 8 weeks. We did a series of surveys and interviews at different points, so before the training, right after the training, and then 4 weeks after the training had completed. And what did we find? So quantitatively, it was actually quite interesting, and I could go down a deep tunnel of discussion on the actual measurement of mindfulness from a research component, because this is nuanced, complex, and in some cases quite flawed. But because I think the primary audience here is not researchers, I'm going to not do that. So I'll just say that we found significant relationships between mindfulness and error attitudes, but not in the way that we thought, in the opposite direction that we would have expected. These were mediated by authenticity, so my willingness to be my true self at work, and self-concept, or sort of my general self-esteem, self-efficacy, etc. So if I was more comfortable being myself, or if I had a higher self-concept, then I was more likely to learn from my mistake, not worry about my mistake, and report my mistake. In other research, we do find that mindfulness has strong relationships with both authenticity and self-concept. So, if mindfulness can be trained, as that's sort of what we presume these days, then this is an encouraging finding. Qualitatively, out of the interviews, what we found was that emotion regulation, our ability to actually observe, acknowledge our emotional experience, and then adapt it in a way that's most optimal for whatever the situation is, was one way that the mindfulness training was helping people shift their attitudes to error. The other was just a general detachment from the outcome. So instead of getting sucked into this story of, oh no, I've just replied all on that email and emailed all of my colleagues this embarrassing response, there was a much more self-compassionate relationship with their behavior And so they weren't scolding themselves for too long, and instead they could just accept whatever had happened as a part of the human experience. They could apply some kindness directly to themselves. Another finding that came out from the interviews was that while initially, once you realize you've made a mistake, you might be considering, how is this going to embarrass me? Who's going to find out? Will I get in trouble? And that would shift quite quickly to, how can I fix this? Who does this impact? The consequences would be fixated on improving the situation or ensuring that the recipients were taken care of, as opposed to oneself. Typically in a work context, when we look at the well-being literature, and that's really where mindfulness became famous, was because of its efficacy in, chronic illness or anxiety, depression, stress reduction, etc. In the work literature, people tend to get excited about performance. So this is David Rock's little equation, and it says performance equals potential minus interference, where interference is these habitual reactions that we have that fly under our radar that are not beneficial, or just our typical cognitive distortions that don't allow us to see clearly as things really are because of our past experience or some bias that we may hold and not be aware of, etc. So our ability to decrease that interference then frees up our potential to increase our performance. So an important question becomes then, what can we do to decrease that kind of interference? And this brings me to this concept of interoception. So interoception is our general awareness of our internal physiological experience. This may be something as sort of overt as, I'm hungry, I can tell that I'm hungry, or it could be more subtle, like a temperature change within the body. It's often measured by our accuracy in perceiving our own heartbeat, and indeed this is what this one study looked at. So they measured traders, so London stockbrokers, and what they found was that traders, people who are making sort of high-risk, highly pressurized decisions, were more accurate in perceiving their heartbeat than other employees that weren't traders. So they have better interoception than others. The second part of this study finds that the higher your interoceptive score would predict how profitable that employee was, and also how long that they were lasting in that high stress position. So interoception, something that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, is actually quite predictive of outcomes that we care a lot about. And importantly, interoception, developing that ability to connect with our internal physiological experience, is actually a very effective way to start decreasing the interference of our cognitive overthinking. So this brings me now to a body scan, because this is a wonderful practice that helps cultivate interoception. So again, we'll take you through sort of a 4 or 5 minute practice here. So if it's available to you, then I'll ask you to sit again back in your chair, taking an upright position. And if it's not, then maybe this is a great time to multitask and do something else and come back to us in about 4 minutes. So if you are joining in, then allow your feet to fall flat on the floor, so no crossing of the legs or the arms. And if you feel comfortable, again, closing the eyes. Just noticing what you're thinking about and bringing your awareness to internal experience. And we're going to start just by bringing all of your attention down into the feet, feeling perhaps the floor beneath the soles of your feet. Perhaps the sensation of your shoes or your socks enveloping your feet. And then taking your attention to the shins and the calves. And just noticing what you feel here. Indeed, you may feel nothing at all, in which case just acknowledge that this is a blind spot. Starting with some more obvious sensations like your pants resting on your legs, and continuing to hold your attention on the shins and the calves, noticing perhaps internal sensations. Any tingling, movement of muscles, maybe nothing at all. And coming to the tops of the legs, the thighs and the quads, perhaps feeling the chair beneath you, perhaps feeling your hands resting on the legs. Noticing perhaps some twitching or tension in the legs, and maybe feeling nothing at all. Should your mind wander, simply recognize that it has wandered and bring it back into the legs. And coming now through the glutes, pelvis, and low back. Just scanning this area of the body, observing without judgment any sensation that arises. Taking that awareness around to the low belly, mid belly, and upper belly. Feeling perhaps the breath move through you. Feeling perhaps the late digestion of lunch or anticipation of your afternoon snack. Feeling any tightness or openness here in the belly. And just allowing whatever you notice to be whatever it is. Coming now to the chest and the upper back. Again, feeling any tension or tightness or openness or stillness. Feeling perhaps simply the chest rising and falling. And now taking your awareness to the arms elbows, wrists, fingers, palms, back of the palms, the whole of the arms. Noticing temperature, sensation of clothing, maybe some itching or tingling or nothing at all. And then becoming aware of the whole body. Wherever you are in your thought, let's take a deep breath in and a full exhale out. And then opening up the eyes if they were closed as we proceed. So that is a foundational practice that shows up in mindfulness-based stress reduction. It shows up in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and all of the other alternatives. It's great to do before bed. In fact, it's been correlated to some studies on insomnia as an effective practice directly related to insomnia. And again, it trains interoception, which helps with decision-making under pressure. Specifically in the workplace, we're seeing a number of different organizations really jump on and sort of seize the mindfulness train, which brings me to the fact that every decade or so it seems to appear on the cover of Time magazine. And again, I think what's making it stick is the fact that there's so much research supporting the findings that are arising. When it comes to how mindfulness is actually being practiced at work, let me give you a few examples. So what I've seen are a number of tech companies right at the forefront. So they may be bringing a mindfulness facilitator in to actually lead a practice multiple times a week, or they bring in some sort of expert that just puts on a lunch and learn, and it's a sort of one exposure that's not continued. There may be programs that you can join, like the Take 5, where you're signing in, it's not expensive, and you just are provided with a guided meditation daily that gets sent to you. One particular company actually enacts what they call mindful retrospectives. So at the end of any project, they spend time bringing in the principles of intention, attention, and attitude to break down the project experience. There's also some that are a little bit more hands-off, so they'll have a dedicated quiet space where they have some cushions available or some mats or blankets, and they leave that option for their employees to access mindfulness or some form of it as needed. Others are building it directly into their wellness program. So they're designing a few sessions that actually teach people the benefits of mindfulness and then different types of practices. You know, EAP providers actually have mindfulness programs in place, and goodness, there's probably some of you on this call that are actually at the forefront of this, but it may just be connecting to someone that has an MBSR practice or a facilitator. And finally, another example is executive retreats. So, you know, if there's a strategic planning session in place, then I'm seeing now more and more different mindfulness practitioners being invited to lead either practices or finding ways to integrate these principles into their strategy sessions. Specifically in the organization that I did my research in, what they had was a very high-level 6-week not expensive training that they were offering the caregivers. So it was just 1 hour over lunch and $70, so very accessible. And also in this hospital, they have the full mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR program, that they offer to both staff and patients. This is a bit more of a commitment, so it's 8 weeks, it's 3 hours, which takes place after work, plus 1 full day retreat, and they were asking $350, which tends to be about the cost that we see these programs in. I had mentioned mindful meetings, so this is in practice. Just at the beginning of your meeting, you take a short pause where you may be paying attention to your breath like we did, or a body scan, or simply just acknowledging what's going on for you in that moment, so that you can break up wherever you've just come from to whatever you're about to embark on with a pause. If you wanted to take that further, then you could also think about asking for a collective intention setting practice where everyone that's in that meeting says, hey, this is what we want to get out of the meeting, and you assign one ambassador to sort of manage the time of that meeting, and then you close with actual action items. So this is a much more regimented process to a mindful meeting. And on the right, I have a picture of the World Economic Forum, because a couple of years ago they were beginning their meetings with a very short mindfulness pause. So just to wrap up, there are some difficulties in bringing mindfulness to work, and I want to sort of openly address them, because if you're thinking about doing this, then it's helpful, I think, to know what you might be up against. So the first is that conceptually and experientially, it is quite different than how we typically experience life. You know, we are used to living outside in. There's lots of external stimulus, and we don't always go inside. That can make us uncomfortable. And that kind of inner work can be particularly uncomfortable because we're not always used to being vulnerable in the workplace, where we spend a lot of time trying to be professional. Then, of course, time as a resource is often the limitation. So it may feel incredibly inefficient to be taking 10, 20, 1 hour out of your day to sit and do nothing. This can feel very anti-intuitive. However, one analogy I have heard is that taking that kind of time in is like pressing Control-Alt-Delete on your computer. So while you have to shut down, in the end, it's actually a much more efficient process afterwards. And then we have this notion that despite your best intentions, it's hard to commit to any kind of practice. And this is the same for eating healthy or for exercise. You know, we know there's good habits, and many times we find them difficult to sustain. The last two is that for people that don't have long-term practices, the benefits or the effects can be quite fleeting. So it's easy to fall off the wagon when we're not having that constant positive feedback loop to shape our behavior. And finally, this notion of ambiguous metrics of success. I think we live in a society and a workplace that likes to see what is the result, what is the tangible result I just got from that action. And this can be quite fuzzy because 1, the effects take time, 2, they require sustained practice, and 3, sometimes just feeling better or less stressed is difficult to actually relate back to an ROI, which organizations tend to really prioritize. So all of these things can make mindfulness at work a little bit difficult. The last slide I would like to leave you with, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time, is that not all of us will have the inclination to explore these formal practices. And indeed, in the workplace, it may not even be possible. So what are some informal ways that we can practice mindfulness if we can't get out to the beautiful temple on the side of a mountain? The first is just bringing some attention to the things that we do automatically so that we're breaking these habits. This could be as simple as brushing your teeth with the opposite hand, or sort of a famous example is in the shower. You know, John Kabat-Zinn will say, how many people are in the shower with you? You know, are you thinking about your boss or your partner or your next meeting? Can you actually just stay in your sensory experience and feel the water, smell the shampoo, etc.? Bringing mindful attention to what you eat, how you're moving, is another wonderful way to practice, and it doesn't take any extra time because we're doing these things anyways. I'll end with one example of crossing the threshold. So each time you enter your cubicle or your office or your home, anytime you're crossing a doorway, do that with complete awareness. So you're aware of what you're leaving behind, you're aware of what you're walking into, and instead of just moving blindly from one area to another, actually cross with some consciousness and intention into the next physical space. So thank you very much for listening. I haven't left a lot of time for questions. In fact, I've gone over. Sorry, Mark.
That's fine. So we will have just a couple more minutes for those that are able to stay for questions. There are some questions that have come up, and I'm just going to look at them. One was just a comment that they really liked the slide with the thinking and the confusion. But why does one need to come back to the anchor if you're aware that you are wandering? I can understand if you are caught up in the wandering, but if you're watching the wandering with awareness.
That's a wonderful question. So there are different types of mindfulness practices, and the one that you are referring to there is something that we would call open wandering. So it's completely open awareness, you have no anchor, and wherever the mind goes, we're just applying this observant, non-evaluative stance to whatever arises. And that's its own practice. It has different correlations to different sets of outcomes. However, it's still cultivating sustained attention because you're still following that thought process with that kind of meta-awareness. And again, that attitudinal component that's so characteristic of mindfulness. It's just a different practice. I hope that helps.
Okay. Has there been some research around, does this work with resistant staff, or is it a purely voluntary basis?
That's such a great question. I haven't seen anything published that's come out on that. From my own experience, because I spend time teaching this in organizations as well as researching, I definitely notice a difference between people that have been that self-select to participate and those that have been mandated to attend. And I think this comes back to intention. So you have to think about why and what you want to get out of that program. And if you're just feigning interest because you've been told to attend by your manager, I think you'll have a different experience no matter what. The other thing I'll say about that is if in that first session or first contact you can establish some credibility or interest in the topic, I find that that actually really softens some of the skepticism and engages more participants, because at the end of the day, I think we're all human and we can relate to the difficulty and downfalls of our mind running away from us. So it's not that hard to actually get everyone engaged so long as you can make an appropriate case that resonates with your audience.
Thank you very much again, Ellen.